Welcome to the Analytics Excellence webinar series, sponsored by Black Hills IP and the SLW Institute. Today's subject will be focusing around using patent prosecution analytics to determine prosecution efficiency and waste and manage prosecution. Today's speakers will be Tom Marlowe and Jackie Spurtell. Tom?
Yeah, hi, thanks, Giles. My name's Tom Marlowe. I currently run operations at Black Hills IP and formerly was in-house running the IP department at Fairchild Semiconductor, where managing outside counsel and a decent amount of prosecution was a critical task.
Hi, my name is Jacqueline Spurtell, and I am currently an analytics specialist at Black Hills IP. And in a former life, I was in-house patent counsel for Thomson Reuters for several years.
All right. Thanks, Jackie. So we're going to talk, according to the title of this webinar, patent prosecution analytics and what to do with them. There's three primary goals, I think, that kind of really summarize how you want to use these analytics. One is, well, frankly, to get insight into what outside counsel is doing and how they're doing it. The other is being able to manage this data, this process, without a tremendous amount of complexity. And the third piece is being able to use the data to improve your system, to improve your process, to improve the way that counsel does their prosecution, and to catch issues and be able to take steps to either save money or wind up with better patents, or ideally both.
But before you can kind of focus on the goals, you need to take a little bit of look at what kind of data you're going to be using to analyze. And I'm sure most of you are aware of kind of public versus private. And so most tools that you're going to use are going to primarily have a public data component. By public data, we mean you can go out to a patent website, or there are data sources that are combing multiple patent websites to grab as much information as they can for you, not only bibliographic information, but also prosecution metrics or examination metrics as well. Now, some tools do provide private data, but that's not generally necessary sometimes because when you're talking about prosecution activity, a lot of that happens after publication anyways. But some tools do allow you to provide private information on that area.
So the uses for these analytics, one, what we've mentioned, management of counsel, and that could be in-house counsel that's doing prosecution, that can be outside counsel doing prosecution. Other uses would be to look outside of your own organization, whether you're taking a look at competitors' prosecution activity, either to determine what are key patents in their portfolios, or to determine where there are particular weaknesses. The third, and one place that I really like to use this type of analysis, is from an M&A perspective. Early on, or at least before the deal is closed, it allows me to get an idea of how well the portfolio has been handled, and gives a nice overview of whether there's going to be a lot of messy prosecution to deal with once that portfolio gets handed over. So it helps from a budgeting perspective, it helps from a valuation perspective. And also, a lot of times, especially if you're doing an acquisition that includes a substantial portfolio, the question is going to come up, do you keep the counsel that has been managing that portfolio, outside firms that are managing it, or do you transfer to your current firms? And using prosecution analytics can give an idea as to how well they've been doing. It's a data point. Similarly, when you're working with partners, so whether these are joint development partners, licensors, licensees. Keeping an eye on how prosecution is going can be very insightful. If you're a licensee of a substantial portfolio, wanting to make sure that prosecution is going well because you're paying to have the protection from those patents is, well, it's important. So there's a couple of perspectives, though, with respect to this data. And I think, Jackie, do you want to go into that a bit?
Absolutely, thank you. So I like to think of this public data, or what we want to do from prosecution. I take a look at it from two perspectives. And the first one of what is currently in prosecution. So these are things where you can make immediate adjustments. Examination is happening. If you see any trends, you want to be able to go back and immediately correct things that are currently there. So that's one perspective, current in prosecution work. Then there's this larger dispositions perspective. And this allows you, dispositions, to pick the time frame that you want. So that's great that you get to make some quick decisions about, there's some RCEs and that number's creeping up, but you also may want to look and say, has this been going on for quite some time, or is it that they just brought new counsel on and it's going to take a little time to adjust? And the disposition perspective allows you to view that and see a longer set of trends over a given period of time. Just as a note, dispositions include not only what could be currently in prosecution, but it would also consider things that have been issued and stuff as well. And so with that, we'll transition over to a possible tool that you might use to provide you with that data analytics.
Yeah, so we're going to take a look at some example data to show how to use these prosecution analytics. There's tools that are available out there. Some of them are better than others. Some of them are, compile the data quicker or in different ways. At the end of the day, you can use one of the tools. Depending on your portfolio size, you may be able to pull this information from PAIR, or you may be able to pull this information from a docketing system and be able to compile it in similar ways to get different views. The views that we're going to see come from a tool that's built on Patent Buddy, and we use them because it's an in-house tool that we use, and it allowed us to create these slides relatively quickly to facilitate this discussion. The data that we're looking at here is going to be all public as well. So let's take a look at a couple of ways that we can slice and dice this. So the first is taking a look at things from a in-prosecution perspective. So these are items that are currently being prosecuted, and we use this information for what I like to call surgical fixes. So I'm going to be looking at the data, and what I'm trying to do is find things that I can go in and improve or fix on a case-by-case basis. Even if I've got a portfolio of thousands, looking at the analytics is going to help me determine, what are the most issue-prone cases that I've got going on right now. Where can I at least start to try and make an impact on spending and protection? So this is, I think, the same slide from just a minute ago, but we'll take a look at some of the data that we have here. Here we've got a fairly substantial portfolio, about 7,600 matters in prosecution. That represents the set of data that we're really going to be digging into. And one of the first places that I like to start is with office action activity. How many of these matters have one office action, two office actions, 3, 4, 5, 6 plus? Generally, what I like to see on this type of a chart is a nice downward taper. And I have a taper like that pretty well here. The fact that I have more second office actions than first office actions, they aren't too far off, so that's not raising too many flags for me. But if I really run out of things to dig into, that might be a place to start.
Yeah, and also I like to kind of draw the attention over to the RCE activity as well. And here you can see that the RCE is having one RCE on it's about 2038, have at least one RCE. That's great. You know, but again, you want to make sure, you know, from a trend perspective, it's going down. You don't want to see as many RCEs, 6+ RCEs, even 5 RCEs. So the trend here looks good, but overall, you may want to consider, you know, how many RCEs, and is it a standard practice that RCEs are acceptable, particularly when you're getting into 2, 3, 4 RCEs for one particular matter.
And
Tom, anything else that you see?
yeah, on the RCEs, one other thing is if I'm looking at a competitor or another third-party portfolio, and I see extensive RCE activity or matters with that extensive RCE activity. So let's say this was a competitor's portfolio, and I'm looking at the matters that have 5 and 6+. That might be a signifier of more important or more valuable patents or patent families. So that might be a place where I can start to look at competitors to see where they're placing the value. At least that's where they're spending money. So that's another useful data point. And then the next chart, so the second one down on the left, this lays out number of office action responses with a bar next to it that tells me how many had interview activity. And the trend here, if I can glean any, is that there's only a very little bit early on, and it creeps up a little bit, and then by percentage tends to go up more and more as we get into the 4th, 5th, and 6th office action, where at the 6th we're actually interviewing over half of the matters. So one of my takeaways here, and this actually may be more systemic, is that we might want to front load some of that interview work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always like, my favorite graph of these is, again, the bottom left, the response extension activity. This is always a key area where, one, you can reduce your cost right away, whether that's an in-house cost to yourself or outside firms taking extra time. But more importantly, this affects your patent term adjustment. So you want to make sure from not only a budget perspective, but also prosecution and getting the most term you can out of your patent or enforceable term out of your patent to reduce these extensions as much as possible. And again, here, there's definitely a trend downward, which is always good. But again, if you look at this last bar, it says 94 here, so it jumped up a little bit on the 6+ office actions. Now you may think this isn't a ratio. So how do I kind of figure out, you know, how often on the extensions versus the office actions? That's where you kind of visually take a look at the graph above it, where it says office action responses compared to the extension activity. And that's quite telling for me because, yes, they filed 94 extensions when it came to 6+ office actions, but there was only 226 6+ office actions. So that's, you know, shy of 50%. However, I come over to the first office action and there's about 1,602 first office actions, but, you know, almost close to 1,000 at 992 did they take extensions on the first office action? So that also could potentially, when we get talking about disposition and time frames and systemic problems, you might also want to consider instituting some, internal best practices along with firm best practices, that you try not to take any extensions, or you try to minimize this overall number.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really good. And the last thing that I want to talk about on this slide briefly is the bottom right corner restriction requirement activity. I personally don't like restriction requirements. I think they can be avoided altogether, saving costs across the portfolio. And when I look at this trend, something's going on. In 2014, we had a lot fewer restriction requirement activity. 2015, it crept up. 2016, it almost doubled from the previous year. So what I would want to know is this something that's happening across multiple firms? Is it one firm that happens to be writing possibly sloppier claim sets? It gives me a place to start digging into my firms in more detail. And so we can actually take a little bit of a look at some of this detail in the upcoming slides.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And that's actually what we're going to do. So in this tool, you are allowed to pick your counsel. So again, that was talking about the overall portfolio, how it's doing as a whole. So now we want to start saying, okay, how does one firm fare on prosecution to another firm, or even in-house as well. So once we pick the counsel, we are kind of going to go through a couple slides here comparing a few firms to in-house counsel. So here's the first one with firm 1. And here we just took a couple of these graphs. We don't want to go into every single graph for every firm, but here's a little bit of information on there are 211 pending in prosecution matters. And as Tom mentioned earlier, actually that was probably me on the RCs if I remember, the trend again is going downwards on RCs. So this is good. However, it's still quite high. 35 have at least one RCE. There's quite a few even that have 2, 3 plus on there. Given that this firm only has 211 matters, the number of RCEs seems a little high here. So while the trend is good, and that's something to take to the firm, the counts, however, seem a bit high, so that might be a talking point with them. Then I naturally kind of gravitate towards this interview activity graph. And you see here there are blue bars and red bars, and the blue is the number of matters by responses filed, and the red is of those how many were interviewed. And the trend, it did seem to be going up a little bit. The fourth office action had 11, so that trend was going up a little. The fifth seemed to dip, but then the sixth really popped back up to 19. And for me, I'd almost love to see this graph swapped. So even recommending to the firm that, yes, probably by the 6+ office action, you're really in constant communication with that examiner and doing a lot of interviews. You may want to also kind of have that interview trend be kind of level throughout office actions, or at least peaking earlier on in the office actions. Tom, do you want to handle firm 2 for me?
Sure. Yeah. So to begin with, since we were just talking about the interview activity, we can see a stark difference in this firm's interview activity. So what we're looking at here is, Jackie just changed slides, is RCE and office action response / interview activity for another firm prosecuting this portfolio. So without even having to compare side by side, we can see that there's a lot less in the red bars on that lower graph. So clearly there's a lot of room for improvement in driving interviews across within this firm. There's only 11 interviews for the 101 responses. On the RCEs, it doesn't seem too terrible. 50 out of 177 have one RCE, and then that drops down pretty quickly, and I don't have any greater than with 3 or greater. So it's not raising a whole lot of flags, but we've got some improvement on the interview activity.
Yeah, so now let's see how in-house counsel does. So again, in this particular portfolio, there's quite a few, over 4,500 on top are pending in prosecution. So clearly this particular portfolio is quite heavy for in-house. So again, you do see that there is a nice trend here that is steeply, going down. They, don't tend to do a lot of 4+ office actions. But again, as Tom pointed out, earlier in the overall slides, even these, 5 and 6+ RCEs, even though there's one matter, those might be ones you want to drill down into and start working with, in-house, internally on how to get those resolved and issued as quickly as possible. But one thing I do want to note that's a little different than the firms before is this quite steep drop between one RCE and 2. So I would see here that there's a little trend in-house that one RCE is acceptable, but they try incredibly hard not to go to that second and definitely not the third RCEs as well. Then dropping down to this interview activity graph, I like what I see here. So again, they have they have tended to on the second office actions, that's the highest amount with 151 interviews. So the trend here does tend to peak earlier than firm 1 and 2. And that is good. The only thing I would really recommend here is that these numbers get a little higher, particularly in the first and second office action areas. I'd like to see those amounts raise up, but the trend is overall better compared to firm 1 and 2 on those. And that kind of ends our in-prosecution piece, and now we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about all dispositions. How I look to think about all dispositions is you're no longer focusing on what's currently in front of you. Now you're looking at a larger picture. And this allows you to be able to determine any systemic fixes that might need to take place. So Tom was talking about surgical fixes, something you need to get in there right away, look into, and effect change immediately on that one particular matter. All dispositions with this larger time frame allows you to step back and say, okay, is there anything firm-wise or in-house-wise that has been happening for quite some time, or is it just recently that a systemic problem has occurred on those? And so with this, we're now going to transition over to showing a 4-year date range. So again, some of these graphs look very similar, but it's not just having pending applications. This includes all dispositions for the past 4 years. So Tom, anything you see that kind of jumps out at you?
Well, the first thing that I see when I look at this is taking a look at the office action activity, the upper left-hand chart. I see what is mostly a nice taper downward to the right. 2200 first office action, 1600 second, and down to 566 fifth office actions. What seems odd to me is the jump into the 6+ office action range, meaning that I've got a lot of cases, more than are sitting in 5th office action that have gone 6 or more office actions out. When I look at that type of information, I see dollar signs because that's very expensive. Generally, I want this trend to continue downward, to have it, as few as those 6+ as possible. Certainly, there's going to be times where there's a strategic reason to have some cases out that long, but it should fit the trend, and this one doesn't. So it's a place where I would start digging.
Yeah, and similarly to the RC graph that we saw in the in prosecution metrics. Again, the trend is good. It seems to, kind of taper down from 2746 down to about 1500, and that is, good. You want to see that trend, but yes, this is 4 years, but you will also see there's quite a few 4, 5, and 6 RCs, and that might be something to drill down into and look at those matters and figure out from a kind of system and an overall disposition standpoint of, why were those RCEs? Were those really important patents? Are they of value? Or were they kind of forgotten about and counsel just kind of kept applying RCEs to keep it going until, in-house counsel said, okay, enough, we need to get this issued and get it off. So definitely stuff to look into, but overall the trend on this RCE is good.
On the interview activity, and we've talked about this a bunch, and it seems like the consensus is we need more interviews and we need them more focused earlier on in prosecution. So when I take a look at these numbers, I see steadily increasing interviews, which I can understand why that happens, right? You get later into prosecution, and as an attorney, you start running out of options. You've got to call the examiner. From an in-house perspective, though, I'd like to see that happening earlier on so that I can avoid that 4th, 5th, and 6th office action. So seeing this more level, at least percentage-wise, and at higher rates, especially early on, is something that I would be pushing for. So maybe changing some procedures with counsel, requiring interviews at the 1st and 2nd office action may help turn some of this around. It might even affect some of the numbers that we see on the graphs on the top.
And Tom, if I remember correctly, I was actually looking at these numbers, particularly through the 2nd through the 6th. It seems to be fairly steady state, a little increase, but fairly steady state. Whereas when we were going in the in-prosecution section, it seemed to be very heavily on the 6+. So again, systemically, this looks much better than it does what stuff's in current prosecution. So again, maybe there's a little surgical fix that needs to happen with some firms or internal practices to get back into the groove of doing some more interviews, because it looks previously, over the past 4 years, that's actually been a fairly steady state there.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And again, I always like looking at that response extension activity to see where I can save some cost and to, get the most term for my buck. And again, I'm amazed by this one that the trend has gone down, but there was just that little uptick on the 6+ office action and the extensions. It went up to 250. A little bit up from 232 on the 5th office actions. But again, those ratios of comparing the office action response to the extension activity, on the 6+, you have 250 extensions, but 764 office action responses. That's a little under a third, whereas if you go back over to the 1st office action, again, you're looking at 2014 and almost 1,400 at 1,392 had extensions on that. So that is quite a higher percentage than the 1/3 that was happening at the 6+ office actions. So again, something to look at from both a term perspective and a cost perspective.
So let's take a look at a little bit of detail now and compare some firms from a systematic perspective. Okay, so Jackie, what are we looking at here?
We are looking at the number of office actions between Firm 1, Firm 2, and in-house. So you will see here that the trends for the most part are going down. That is good. However, things that I like to note here is firm number 2. It tends to have a few office actions that drag out on those 4th, 5th, and 6th office actions. However, firm one was doing great with, little to none, but then they popped up a little bit on 3 office actions. So they all seem to have a little bit of stragglers, but the best one here seems to be in-house, where they have no 6+ office actions, and they're trying, very hard to stay in the 1 to 2 office action range.
Okay, so let's take a look at RCE activity. Here we're comparing 2 firms and in-house again. When I take a look at this data, I don't really, no real firm specific issues jump out at me. I see firm 1 is doing a few more RCEs in the third, fourth, and fifth. That might be a little bit concerning. They're also handling a lot more matters. Firm 2, similarly in-house, there's just fewer to deal with, so I think that's accounting for some of the lower numbers in the third, fourth, or more. So I think there's nothing that I would necessarily want to drive on a pure firm by firm level. If I want to decrease my third, fourth, and fifth RCEs, then I think that's more of just a pure systemic issue I would approach.
Yeah, I agree. And moving on to our office action per interview. Here, there's comparing firms 1, 2, and in-house. The biggest change the biggest notice I see here is the lack of interviews at all. So you have, firm 1 seems to be doing the most interviews, but it seems to be much later on. The 6+ office actions, they have 3 office actions, and then 2 of them they interviewed. I know that's a small amount, but again, that's where they seem to be focusing. Very few at the first office action level for firm 1. That also seems to be the same kind of trend for firm 2, but almost the most interesting piece is that the couple that in-house has chosen to take, they've only done 1 interview. So maybe that's something internally that they need to discuss on doing some more interviews. And with that, then they maybe could take on, some more work in-house and relying less on firms.
Yeah, and you definitely see, again, systemic issues with just not doing enough interviews across the board, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And when we're looking at our allowance rates across each of our firms, again, the nice thing is that each firm and in-house appears to be prosecuting to allowance fairly similarly. So I feel good about that there's consistency across the firms. The biggest thing takeaway here would probably be just with the relatively large quantity of 0 office action allowances. So obviously these are great from a budgeting standpoint, because we don't even have to get to the costs of an office action response. But I think this is more than I would expect. And so it's something that I want to dig into. Are these the result of heavy continuation activity, where the claim sets are pretty much ready for allowance by that time? We've gone through a lot of prosecution. Okay, then I can get comfortable with it. Or is this the result of writing claims that are too narrow to begin with, and just make it too easy for an allowance to happen, and I'm probably giving up some claim scope, which is something that I'd want to avoid. So again, any of this analytic data is not necessarily conclusive in and of itself, but it gives you a place to start digging and better understand how things are operating.
Yeah, and another area to dig into is restriction requirements. And Tom mentioned that it's a pain point for him, and the restrictions are, in in his view, unnecessary, and I agree with him on those. And so with this graph, you can kind of compare the firms again to in-house. And if you're just looking at the numbers here, you can see 383 restriction requirements for in-house. However, when you compare that to the overall restrictions that were happening, and go back to the overall screen, actually only 7% of what was done in-house had restriction requirements. Firm 2 came in second place, even though they had 17 restriction requirements. Actually, compared to the overall portfolio percentage that they had, only 8% of their stuff had restriction requirements. And here with Firm 2, where it had the least number, which is 14 in this graph, however, given the size of the portfolio they're responsible for, they had up to 10% of theirs was a restriction requirement. So sometimes the numbers here where they've only had 14 restrictions, yes, that might seem low, but when you compare that to the overall percentage of the portfolio they have, that might be an area where you need to, chat with that firm about, making sure that, the claims are in a position where there's not restriction requirements for that.
So in this slide, we're taking a look at the comparisons of the firms in the in-house based on the amount of time a response leads to an allowance. So the amount of the time one office action response leads to allowance, or it takes 2, or it takes 3, or it takes 4, or it takes 6 or more. And what I like to see on these types of charts are higher numbers on the front end, especially with the second office action response, which is fairly reasonable if you think about how prosecution goes. You get your first office action, you write a response, you get your final, and ideally you respond and get an allowance. It's kind of an ideal path to go. You don't have to go into RCE. And so I like to see a larger percentage on the first and second, and I like to see it then, I guess, just relatively, those are where they should be heavier. Firm 1 looks pretty good. Firm 2, their highest percentage of allowances isn't until you get to 6+ office actions. That has me a little concerned. So this signifies that there's something going on here. Either they're handling very complex stuff that just takes longer to explain to the examiners, or they're kind of taking it easy on their office action responses, and not really pushing too hard to get an allowance early on. So my biggest takeaway from this slide is we probably have to take a look at what's going on with firm number 2 and see if things need to get shored up a little bit.
And the last set of charts that we saw in the overall portfolio, and now here compared with firm 1, 2, and in-house, these are the extension activities. So here, all of the trends are generally downwards. Firm 2 did dip a little bit on the 4th office action, come back up a little bit on the 5th, and go down on the 6th again. However, overall, the trend is that they go down in number. However, naturally, they would go down because not too many things that are in prosecution or with previous dispositions would have a lot of 6+ office actions. So overall, the recommendation that I've been saying throughout this webinar is just getting these numbers down. So the trend here is good. Now let's just get fewer extensions, not only for the firms, but also internally here as well.
Yeah, and some of these would be good to look at, just on that last slide, would be good to look at as a percentage of the office actions for each time period. And then, I mean, the beauty of some of these numbers is all of this is avoidable. So if you're starting to get big budget constraints, this is an easy place to attack by just putting in stricter controls with outside counsel. It's not going to cost you any more as far as attorney time, but you'll save a bunch of money on those extension fees.
Absolutely.
And so this last graph that we've got here compares the firms in the in-house provisional filings, or I should say converted provisionals, priority filings, and continuations, divisionals, basically follow-on cases. So the provisional based are in blue, the regular priority filings in green, and then your continuations, divisionals, follow-ons are in, I think that's like a brown color. The takeaway from this is that if I'm going to analyze this, one of the trends that looks interesting is if you look at the bottom graph around 2011, 2012, more original priority cases were filed in-house. Additionally, during that same time period, or just slightly after it, more continuations divisional CIPs were filed by the two firms, the two outside firms. This is something that I would want to take a look at because when I bring more cases to be filed in-house, generally that's because we're trying to save costs by keeping the filings internal. But what sometimes can happen is that we see outside counsel pushing more continuations and divisionals in order to maintain a heightened billing level, which is kind of adverse to my plan of cutting costs. So this would tell me, okay, I did a good job of keeping costs down from a filings perspective, but outside counsel found a way to keep their billing up, and that might be something that I want to address. And from there, that pretty much concludes some of the analysis around prosecution that we're discussing today. And we showed a lot of charts and graphs out of this particular tool, Patent Buddy, that we like to use. And like I said, some of this information can be gleaned out of docketing systems or by compiling data, especially if you don't need all the charts. If there's a particular data point that you're looking for, whether it be interview activity or RCE activity, you don't necessarily have to use an analytics tool with the fancy graphs, but if you have it available, it does make it quick. So with that said, I think we can open up the floor to questions.
Yeah, there was a question here about, you know, does anyone sell these kinds of analytic services? And yes, you know, SLW, you know, I believe does it for clients, and Tom, you can correct me if I'm wrong on there. That's an offering they do, but Black Hills IP also can do the services as well. And you can, I believe there's a contact somewhere through our webinars where you can reach out and someone will get back to you on those, or that might even be on the survey as well if you want to be contacted.
Yeah, that's right. Both of the sponsoring companies will provide these services, and both use the tool that displayed all the Patent Buddy tool with the graphs that we're showing here, so you'd have access to the same analytics.
Give it another moment. Does anyone have any other questions or comments on that? I know that there was a comment about kind of some of the quality of the graphs. Unfortunately, we did try to, get it in so people could see as much as possible. But I do know that we reproduce these slides. So hopefully you get a better chance to go back and grab those and can kind of zoom in on the areas that you're interested in.
So we got another question, which is, can these tools be used in trying to select a firm? The answer here is yes. You have to do a little bit more legwork on the front end in order to use tools like this to select a firm, which is a good idea. What you'd want to do is find current clients of the law firm that you're going to be looking at, and then pull together some exemplary pieces of a portfolio. Ideally, I would recommend across a few clients and see what kind of trends the firms that you're looking at have, and to be able to do some comparisons. With the Patent Buddy tool, you could do that by simply pulling in a whole bunch of patents. Say there's a technology class that you were interested in, pulling in a select group with some statistical significance, a few thousand in that class. And you could take a look at the patent attorneys or firms that prosecute in that class and then do similar comparisons. So basically treating the class like your company and see how the different firms have trended within that class. Another question is the public data for US only? Well, so with respect to the tool that we've been showing, at the moment it's all US based pair data. If you're going to be doing this analysis, say in-house at your corporation, and you're going to be using the data from your docketing system, then you could leverage more than just US data for some of these analytics.
Excellent. I think that is all of the questions we had for today. Thank you guys very much. I have one more slide here, and that is, my apologies. Please join us for the next analytics presentation, and that topic is using patent portfolio and filing trend analytics to help guide patent portfolio development. Quite a mouthful, but I'm sure it'll be very informative. That will be on April 5th, 2017 at 1 p.m. Central. Thank you everyone for your time, and have a wonderful afternoon.